Welcome to the test set. Here we talk with some of the brightest thinkers and tinkerers in statistical analysis, scientific computing, and machine learning, digging into what makes them tick, plus the insights, experiments, and OMG moments that shape the field.
Michael's traveling at the moment, so you're stuck with a producer's voiceover this week. On this episode, the test set crew jams with Colgrove, CTO and co-founder of Hex, the data platform that somehow counts a Sweetgreen head chef among its power users. Caitlin joins Michael, Hadley, and Isabel to make the case that data teams aren't going anywhere. But right now, their job is changing from writing SQL to vouching for the answers. We hope you enjoy.
Caitlin, welcome to the test set.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming on. Just by way of introduction, you're Caitlin Colgrove, the CTO of Hex, and I'm Michael Chow. I'm the host of the test set, and I'm joined by Hadley Wickham, chief scientist at Posit, and Isabel, software engineer extraordinaire at Posit. And we're so excited to have you on. I feel like Hex is everywhere today, and I'm constantly trying to explain to people what Hex is and why they should use it. I know Hex is included in Claude.ai now. Maybe, do you mind just explaining a little bit about what Hex is and what it does?
Yeah, totally. Hex started when we started as founders. We'd all left Palantir and we were kind of out in the world looking at how people were working with data. And what we discovered was that there were a lot of new patterns for working with data that were emerging. People were a lot more technical. There was a lot less clicking of buttons and a lot more writing of code, SQL, Python, all of that. And the tools out there were Jupyter notebooks. Those are very popular. This is 2019 or so. But in order to actually sort of string together a full, enterprise data workflow, like to actually do something useful with your data, people would be doing these ad hoc analyses in Python. SQL, to do SQL in a notebook, you still had to do the backticks. It was like really not native. And then, that was in a notebook and it was a locally running notebook with your own Python environment. And okay, so maybe you do this whole analysis and like, what are you going to do? Are you going to email that notebook to the CFO? Like that you can't do that. So they would take these notebooks and they're like, okay, we're going to turn it into a Python script. And then we're going to run the Python script on a schedule on AWS. And then we're going to dump the output into Looker so that the CFO can look at it in Looker so that they can take a screenshot of the chart and put it in the board deck. And that was the workflow. And so Hex was really born of this idea that there just has to be a better way, that there needs to be first-class tooling for this new era of data work. And that was the original product that we built. And then obviously, in the past couple of years, AI has become a huge part of that. And I think even though some of the technology has changed, the underlying story is still true. It's people who are working with day in and day out, what are their workflows? What are the best tools for them? And Hex should be that.
I've seen so many engineers in Python use pandas read SQL, that classic pandas.read SQL with a string of SQL in it.
Yeah.
Which feels like maybe a little bit unnatural. And then
more than a little bit unnatural.
Yeah. And that scheduling dynamic, just all these bits of duct tape kind of in the process. I'm really curious. I know with the Anthropic integration, what does that look like for a person to use Hex?
Yeah, so I think this is one of the big ways that work is changing. Pre-AI, you basically had these big, heavyweight vertical SaaS tools, and depending on what you wanted to do, you would navigate to HubSpot, or you would navigate to Salesforce, or you would navigate to Hex, because you're like, I want to do something with my marketing data. I want to do data science, data analysis, and that would be where you would start. And so you'd have these big, full-featured front doors to these vertical applications. Today, everybody just starts by asking Claude or ChatGPT a question. And we've actually had some really, really interesting conversations with the Anthropic team and the OpenAI teams about how they're seeing the changing and sort of the emergence of these new workflows. And they really view a lot of these chat applications as a front door. They're not going to go and build, a first-class data science agent or a first-class, customer service agent or all of these things. They want to be the platforms on which those things run. But still today, like it's very sticky, these habits of just ask your question to Claude. And so what Anthropic released, and ChatGPT has sort of its own version as well, is this plugin architecture. And it's based on MCP, as you might imagine, but they've enhanced that with sort of more UX around it. So now if you hook up your MCP to Claude, you actually get a interactive Hex experience in Claude. And Claude, the models are actually smart enough to know how to route. So if you go and you have Hex wired up as your sort of data science backend, and you ask a question, Claude knows that the Hex plugin is the plugin to use to answer that. And so it'll actually go and it'll go kick off sort of a sub-agent architecture where it kicks off an agent in Hex, which will go look at all your data. It'll go look at all your semantic models. It'll do all this stuff and it'll come back. And it's actually really nice. You get to like sort of see the thinking tokens. You can get an interactive set of charts back. And then if you really want to go deep, or you want to go build a dashboard, or you want to do something further, you can kind of click through into the underlying Hex project that it's been building up behind the scenes.
What's a question I could ask that might produce like a Hex widget? Like, is it like if I wanted to check the weather in different cities, or like, let's say we just had,
what's something you've used Hex to answer about like Hex?
Well, today, so Hex is typically most useful for the types of enterprise data workflows where it's all governed in the data warehouse. You've probably done some modeling on top of it. You probably have some dashboards, maybe you have your KPI dashboards or whatever. Those, it's like sort of classic data workflows. And then you can start to pull in other sources, obviously via MCP and other things. But it's very similar to, pre-AI, the types of things that you'd be managing with dbt and Snowflake and all of those things. And so it's usually business data. And if you're syncing other sources, those are to enhance the questions that you're asking about the business data. So these days, I'm asking a lot of questions about how much we're spending on Anthropic, where are those tokens coming from, how are people using these products. And so it's a sort of, I would call it a combination kind of finance, product analytics type workflows. And so basically what we're doing is we're piping all of our logging around the usage of Hex's AI into Snowflake and all of those like fine-grained token counting and, attribution and where those are coming from. And so I'm spending a lot of time looking at, where are we spending the most tokens? Are there places where we could be being more efficient? We also have a lot of data around, our internal evals and performance. And so are there areas where we should be using Opus and we can't actually drop down to something like Sonnet or Haiku? So I spent a lot of time looking at that in Hex.
We know that like models can be like pretty sycophantic. Like how much do you worry about like when you come in with a question and there's like an sort of an answer that like you want to hear, and then like do you worry about you kind of accidentally steering the model in that direction that just reinforces like what you want to hear?
Yeah, I think that's actually one of the bigger model behavior is one of the bigger problems in sort of agentic AI for data science today. And it's a combination of that. I think it's a less of the sycophancy side of things that we see, but we see a lot of confidently incorrect. So the models will, instead of doing what even a relatively junior data scientist would do, which is you start looking at the data, you start exploring, you get to an answer, and then you check that answer. Maybe you look at some other, other sources to see if you can corroborate what you're seeing. Models don't do that at all. They find a table, they're like, this table has a column that looks like it should be useful, and then they just go. And so that's one thing that we're thinking a lot about is like, how do we give the models, how do we push them to explore the space more? And how do we push them to sort of self-validate in a way that more likely will, because often, and you see this even with humans, right? If you start at different points in the data and there's different ways and different assumptions that you might make about how to answer a question, you can end up with just wildly different answers. And you kind of want to look at all of those and understand, okay, well, what's the actual sort of truth here?
There's a lot of knobs to turn when making sure that the model is, being a little bit more creative, maybe thinking a little bit harder about the answers. What are maybe the knobs that you're thinking about in Hex to make sure that this is being solved?
Yeah, I think the models these days are the reasoning steps are actually quite good and quite solid. And if you rewind a couple of years and hallucinations and just like them not paying attention to the things that you want them to pay attention to are huge, huge problems. And even just keeping them on task. These days, I actually find that they're quite creative in taking the pieces of information that they have and putting them together into an answer. Like it's actually like really impressive when you read their thinking traces, how much they're able to like hit a roadblock and overcome it and like cycle through that in order to get to an answer. Where I usually see the problems happening is, as I was saying before, in them having not sufficiently explored the space. And so they're very, very good at coming up with an answer based on what they have. But if they don't have all of the pieces that you need them to have, then that's where they'll kind of fall on their face. They may even have an answer that looks plausible, but it's actually not what you want, or maybe they won't even get to an answer. So what we're thinking about is that exploration phase. And you see this in other modes too, like in coding, you have can have a plan and design phase and then an implementation phase. That's something that we're thinking about how we bake into our models, where you don't necessarily just like start from the question and have them go at it. You actually kind of push them to look harder for things before they come back and start to actually then go and do the analysis.
Just to be sure, I'm going to try to paint in exquisite detail what it looks like to use Hex, just because it's such an interesting, cool experience. But I also think some people, when I talk to people, some people listening, I think might have trouble if you've never used Hex, like just conveying it that, and correct me for anything I get wrong, but if I understand, it's kind of like you have often like data in the warehouse and say like an analytics engineer or some people have tried to transform and kind of curate what you need. And you might even be a person who doesn't do a ton of data analysis. You might be working in like finance or no shade on finance or like another area. And essentially you go into this notebook that's wired up to your warehouse. And right now you're able to ask an agent essentially a question. And then what happens is it starts populating cells that run and produce outputs. And some of these outputs even are like filters. So it might be like a drop down to select like something you're interested in, or to filter a company that you might want data on. And then essentially like you can adjust the filter and everything else in the notebook will kind of update. So you can sort of like build this notebook and explore your data at the same time. But then what I think is also interesting that I just want to make sure to mention is, if I understand, you also have an app mode. Is that right? Yeah. Where you kind of shift from seeing the code in the notebook view to the app mode, where the code sort of like goes away or is more hidden. Is that?
Yeah, that's all totally correct. I think you can think about it in Hex as the backbone of the product is this notebook. And we were just chatting about this earlier. That notebook actually under the hood is essentially a graph of transformation nodes that we can run behind the scenes. And then you can take that notebook, which we call project in Hex, and you can do a bunch of different things with it. So you can manipulate it with the agent. So the agent will actually like edit that graph. It will build up that graph. And you can do that, just to do sort of some exploratory analysis. But often what you want, and this is actually one of the huge pain points that Hex was solving in the early days, is, data workflows don't end with getting a number. They end with making a business decision. And so the way you get from I have an answer from the data to we've actually decided to do something, there has to be sort of a collaboration and presentation and sharing step. And so what we've done with Hex, it used to be excruciatingly difficult to go from those analyses to that, screenshotting charts into PowerPoint and things like that. And so what we've done is we've actually layered a presentation layer directly on top of the notebook. So it's exactly the same. It's a typical more dashboard-like experience, I would say. We call them apps because they can be more powerful under the hood than what you would expect from a traditional dashboard. And then you can also really extend this. So this has actually like been such a versatile paradigm for us. So Hex has the notebook and the notebook agent, which is really geared towards technical people. It's people who want to be in the code. Even if the agent's writing it, they want to be looking at it and working with it. But there's a lot of people in the organization who don't want to look at the code, but also still want to be able to take advantage of the power of the Hex agent. And so what we have is our conversational agent, which we call threads. But under the hood, it's actually the same as the notebook agent. Mm. And so what it's doing,
I love it puts a different hat on.
Yeah, it's a skin.
Yeah.
But it's actually building up a notebook behind the scenes. And this is really, really powerful because it means that if you get to the end of this conversation and then you want to do something with it, maybe that thing is share it. Well, great. You're in a notebook. You can like make the same types of dashboards, things like that you could before. Or maybe you're like, hey, I don't know if this is right. I actually want to send it to the data team to check my work. Well, the work's all there in the notebook behind the project.
Yeah, Hadley, I know you, in R, it's super different, right? Like the analysis, the kind of workflow, like versus a notebook where you're sort of like, this workflow is so great. If I'm understanding, it's kind of like, whoops, I made a dashboard. Like you do your notebook stuff, but then you have a dashboard at the end.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because the sort of heritage of R is this like REPL, this run, eval, print loop, where you're in the console trying stuff out, and that's kind of your primary like means of exploration and experimentation. And then as you discover things you kind of believe to be true, like that's when you record them like into a script. And that's kind of what led to R Markdown and Quarto, which is like you've written this mingling of prose and code, like much like a notebook, but you run the whole thing and that produces your output. And that has some like big advantages, like kind of pre-reactive notebooks. Very easy in a Jupyter notebook to kind of get into this state where you've like run some cells in like different orders and there's no way to reproduce what you've done. Like no way to have that problem with R Markdown because you always run it from scratch. Like there's a different set of problems, obviously, a different set of trade-offs, but like that's the one problem you never experience.
Yeah. And then I guess there's often a dashboard phase after.
Yeah, and so the thing that you produce might be a document, it might be a dashboard, it might be a presentation. Like I think that same like underlying thing, and you're putting on like different hats for different people, that's like such a valuable metaphor. I mean, we kind of often joke in engineering, I guess, are like, oh, that's a DAG, that's a directed acyclic graph. Like everything's, oh, that's an immutable DAG, that's a reactive DAG. Like, oh, wow, what a surprise. Like we've created a DAG and it turns out to be the right model. Like it's just.
And sometimes, so at obviously the Hex notebook, as we've been talking about behind the scenes, is DAG. And as the cells within the notebook got more and more complicated, we started to realize that the cells themselves needed to be DAGs. And so then you have DAGs and DAGs and DAGs, it's DAGs all the way down. And actually, what is a DAG of DAGs? It's just a DAG.
Yeah. It's kind of like it feels like every problem with an LLM you solve with like another LLM. Like you don't know if your LLM is doing a good job or not. Well, let's have a different LLM judge whether it's doing a good job. And it's like turtles all the way down.
And another thing, just to not to keep buttering up Hex, but OpenAI, they released their one of their reports was using Hex. Is that right? Like a state of data?
Probably Anthropic.
Anthropic.
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
I got to be careful about my.
Yeah.
Do you recall what that was? There was like a.
I don't know specifically what you're referring to. There's a few times where we've seen Anthropic kind of use Hex in their
pops up.
Yeah, because they're Hex customers.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's fun to like watch their live streams and like spot the Hex chart.
Yeah. For Hex.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. And I know you mentioned Sweetgreen as an example.
Oh yeah, this is a recent one. Hex is like the whole spectrum of customers. It's like very traditional data science all the way to some of these use cases that you would just never imagine. So Sweetgreen just signed on as a Hex customer, and this was the wildest one that I've heard in a while. They use Hex to monitor the temperature of their ovens so that they can correlate customer complaints about the temperature of their food to what's happening on the ground in their restaurants. It was wild. Every now and then you come up with you hear some of these things from customers. It's actually one of the really fun things about building a product that's so flexible and so horizontal.
Did the head chef have like a lot of data experience? Like what's
I'm not sure. I actually haven't met him personally, but this is one that we heard kind of from our field teams. Yeah.
Like one of the things I've sort of been thinking about, like how like as these people who never would have worked with data in this way before because they couldn't program, like, and now they can because they can write in English. But, there's a lot of like vocab and like ways of thinking about data that you don't have and you can't express in everyday English. Like, how do we start to like train those people up to give them like the basic kind of like that kind of gut feel for like, I should be a little bit skeptical here, or like, oh, what I need right now is like a smooth, or like I need tidy data, or how do you all think about that?
Yeah, so I think this is an unsolved problem broadly, in that I think building these agents to behave like a data scientist, truly, I think we haven't gotten there yet, and there's a lot more work to be done there. But I actually think that this is one of the big breakthroughs broadly in terms of AI for data and really enabling a much broader spectrum of people to work with data. Because yes, there's the actual can you write code aspect of it, but if you look at sort of the prior generation of data tools, even ones where you don't have to write any code, people still don't use them. The lay people in the organization do not use them. Like we talked to a Looker, an ex-Looker customer, now they're a Hex customer, and they said, they bought Looker for everybody. And in practice, it was like they looked at the last 90 days and only 2 people in the company had made like new dashboards in Looker. And when you like unpack that a little bit, it's just buttons, right? You don't have to write code. How hard can it be? It's actually that doing data work is just inherently very complex. And so none of these tools, code or otherwise, were walk-up usable. There was just too much foundational knowledge that you needed in order to be able to be effective in the tool. And so one of the big breakthroughs besides the, LLM writing code bit is actually imbuing the agents with that knowledge. And today, that's already a lot of what we're doing with the Hex agent is like teaching it not just like, how to write code, but, how to work with the data, your tribal knowledge around the organization of what data is where, all of those things you bake into the agent. And so you're starting to see this pattern across agents and general purpose models with skills and things like that. Again, I don't think we've totally nailed it because I think even with a skill, some of these more specialized domains like data and data science, the models haven't been post-trained on it as rigorously as they have been with coding. I think there's still a fair amount of headroom, but it's like, even if it's, 60, 70%, it's still massively better than someone who's never really thought about how to work with data before. So internally at Hex, we have this feature that we call guides, which is basically skills. And some of them are like, this is how this data set is shaped and things like that. And some of them are, this is how we do data analysis at Hex. These are the types of things that you should do. And the models are pretty good at adhering to it today. But again, as we've been talking about, if there's any kind of like judgment or anything that they would need to off-road on, that they're like much, much less good at.
It is. And like, I think one of the things a good data scientist has always done, like you come with a question and then the data scientist like helps you turn that into a question that you can actually answer like with the data you have. And like, if you just go into the data warehouse and you just start asking questions, you just don't even know like the right questions to ask. And that's such a valuable kind of, and we're starting to get that a little bit with LLMs. I think they can at least help you brainstorm and kind of say, oh, hey, you could ask this instead. But yeah, it's interesting time to be a data scientist.
The other thing that we do in Hex that I think is very powerful is the agents have access to not just the underlying data warehouse, but the other things that people are doing with the data. And so some of this is going to be garbage, just like, people not knowing what they're doing. But, you may have that company dashboard that gets looked at, thousands of times a day or whatever. And that is actually a very rich source of context for the agent for how you should do something. And so when a user comes in is like, I want to know something about revenue, they may not know anything about how we actually calculate revenue, but that's actually encoded in various places in your data workspace that the agent
which is because that's also how humans work, right? Often that's not documented. You have to go to another successful project and like copy and paste that
exactly.
code.
Yeah, that was an interesting point I think I saw posted recently, was like this idea of maybe like some of your best documentation is just the other projects around, and the agents, it's, if I understand, y'all made it so the agent can essentially like look across projects so that if it doesn't exist like in the documentation or in the models, it can sort of figure out how someone else maybe like went off-road or used some kind of like knowledge in their head to do something.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the idea here is it's always been extremely difficult and basically impossible for humans to exhaustively and thoroughly document their entire data ecosystem and then maintain that and keep them up to date. So what are the other places that you can go to understand how to use particular parts of data or how to do particular types of analyses? And it's a range, because when you have the documented context, for the most part, that's like highly trusted, and that's something that the agents can just rely on. But then everything else is this range you could go all the way down from like, oh, I'm just gonna like look at the SQL queries that were executed against this table, all the way up to, you have a project that, is highly used and maintained by the data team. And in Hex, we have this mode called endorsements, where basically the data team can put a tag on it that's like, this is like a blessed
like
thing.
a gold star.
Yeah, it's essentially, yes.
Yeah.
And all of this is to help guide the agent towards, you want it to be able to take advantage of all the context that it's able to, but you also want it to be able to distinguish between the highly trusted parts and then the less trusted parts.
Because I think that is like one of the risks of agents, because they can be so much more productive. You just get stuck in this loop where they kind of get worse and worse and worse, and a greater and greater proportion of your internal dashboards and stuff are written by agents, and they're just learning from other agents who made mistakes like 15 months ago. And yeah, like that kind of idea of saying like, we also need to give feedback, like these are the really good things, like copy from that, not from.
And this, I think, is one of the key sort of new jobs to be done for the data teams, if that makes sense. And a big part of Hex that we haven't really talked about yet, but is relatively new post-agent, is what we call the Context Studio, which is basically about observability and management of all of the context for all of the agents. And so you can see what people, what the agents are actually doing. For each thread, you can actually see what context the agent is using. And then we have a sort of like a separate set of agentic workflows around managing the context, around extracting the pieces out of these things. And then feeding that back into the like highly trusted, highly governed context to kind of avoid this like spiraling problem of, the agent just kind of deciding that that's the way to do something, and then that producing sort of being a self-fulfilling prophecy over there. You can actually like break that. You can see that it's actually doing something that's incorrect, and then update your human managed context, which is prioritized, more highly above the kind of ambient context for the agents.
I was gonna say, I'm really curious. I read recently that now more agents are deploying code on Hex than humans. How do you manage, as someone who obviously cares so much about their users and like is giving people such a beautiful suite of tools, like what are you making for agents versus what are you making for people nowadays?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think in the early days of building the Hex agent, it was very clear that the tools that we'd built for humans were actually also very good for agents. And so there was a lot of overlap. We had this modular notebook structure. It looks a lot like tools that you can give to the agent. And the agents just took to that very naturally. And that was like the first generation, I would say, where it was pretty one-to-one. But now that we've had this sort of crossover moment of more code is being written in Hex by agents than by people, you start to think about what that implies for the rest of the system. And you still want the human interfaces, because there are still times where people are going to come in and tweak things, and it's not fully via natural language. Like sometimes typing a whole sentence is just a very inefficient way to do something that's as opposed to clicking a button. But at the same time, knowing that over time, more and more of this is going to get produced by agents, it actually gives you a lot of opportunities to build things that are useful for agents, but less useful for humans, but are very powerful for the agents. And so, one thing that we've thought about in Hex is, could we give the agents like slightly different, all of our cells are built to be, they're very sort of like easy to inspect. You get a little preview, you get all of these nice UI features. Agents don't need that. And actually, they're quite expensive. So if an agent is kind of building up a project, could you give it a slightly different set of tools that would have different characteristics? Maybe, less data warehouse load. Maybe it runs faster. Maybe it's just, honestly, sometimes the agents like to work in a different way than humans. They've been trained on a certain distribution of data, and it's not exactly what our human brains have been trained on. And so I do think that there will be some divergence there, but the power of Hex is that these things are shared across, like they're interoperable, and that I think that will continue to be true for a while.
One of the things I really like about the kind of Context Studio is it feels like Hex is sort of thinking, well, like the job of like what a data team or data science do is changing. This is going to be one of the things where you give value to your organization, as opposed to like there's also a lot of startups out there today which their pitch is basically like buy us and fire your data team, which as a data scientist doesn't feel very nice.
Well, we were talking to a head of data, and he said something that was really interesting. And I think when you frame it in this way, it made it really clear to me, why data teams are not going away. He said, my job is to vouch for the correctness of the data and the answer that you get. Like he was sort of, he was the head of the data team, and obviously like that's slightly different role than ICs on the data team. But when you frame it like that, you're like, oh yeah, actually, like in the abstract, that is when you don't have people clicking buttons, that is the job of the data team. The job of the data team is to make a system that produces correct answers. And today, a lot of that has to do with, instead of being the person who writes the SQL that is correct, it doesn't have bugs in it, how do you set up the context layer such that the agents can arrive there themselves?
I mean, like the depressing thing is like definitely in corporate America, there is like having the person to fire when something goes wrong is like important. Well, I mean, more positively, like someone has to own this stuff and be like, yeah, it's my reputation on the line that this is correct. Like you can't just distribute that to a bunch of like nebulous agents that no one really understands.
Yeah, and I think ownership is not just like it's my reputation on the line, but it's like, my job is to make sure that this functions. And because it's, in organizations, like this data is being used for, answering existential questions, like the business needs someone to care that is correct and to, build the system that is correct rather than just kind of assuming that everything's going to be fine and figure it out.
But it does feel like the data teams are going to get more like unhinged analyses from execs. Like that's also going to have to be part of their job. Like someone has done something that they think is really cool. Like, that, and it is cool. It is really cool that more people in the org are like interacting directly with the data. But the consequence of that is like more people are going to be making mistakes, and the data team is going to have to like walk them back.
Yeah, you already see this. You see this in software engineering. Like, a CEO will come in and like, use Cursor or whatever to like vibe code some insane thing and then like make a pull request because like all the like traditional barriers to that happening. And then, the engineers are kept to go in and like review this thing. I do think you'll start to see a similar pattern like that in data where all of a sudden people have all of these really powerful tools at their fingertips and they don't know how to use them. And I think there's a couple things there. One is, in Hex, we're thinking a lot about building review tools, both, manual and also agent-assisted review tools, so that process is as painless as possible. But I also think it's just another indication of, where there will still be value. Like there are times where you actually want an expert to do the analysis. There's many, many ways to do the wrong things with statistics. And if you have a very important decision, there will still be a time and a place for people to kind of do those things and not just have someone, fire off an agent query and not be able to really think critically about the result they're getting.
It's funny you say that because our CEO got in trouble with our IT department for an app he vibe coded with HR data. But
I think it's so like maybe empowering and lovely to think about, data scientists are coming with all of the muscles for, really productive AI usage. Like data scientists do a lot of experiments. Data scientists know you look at something, say, wow, this is bad. Like let's scrap it all and start again. So I think there's something really interesting, and especially with the aid of things like review tools built in the loop, no better time ? To be someone who's writing code to do data science.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of hype around AI engineering and things like that. And we internally at Hex have an AI engineering team. But one thing that I've observed is sort of the lines between our AI engineering team and our data team really blurring and starting to overlap. And so, for example, a lot of things that we'll do internally for ourselves to build our own product and build our own agent, we'll build, we have evals, we have various other things that we've built. We'll look at those and be like, oh, we should actually take those and put those into the product for our customers, because these workflows of, building a highly trusted agent actually, converge over time.
Yeah. Who runs Hex's internal context studio? Who's the person curating that?
Yeah, that's our data team.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they are like our number one dog fooders. For obvious reasons. Yeah.
do you see the lines blurring elsewhere? Like it, not just because, I guess like in our, like we're starting to see like designers who previously would create, like a beautiful thing and turn it over to engineers to implement. Now they can deliver a working prototype, or like product people who previous were like, hey, engineer, can you implement this? They just go away and do that. Like, are you seeing that blurring of lines in your engineering org too?
I would say absolutely. but I think it's a little bit less dramatic at Hex than maybe at other places, because our org has always kind of been designed like this, if that makes sense. Most of our PMs used to be technical, like actually hands-on technical in some capacity. All of our designers, we like give them an interview that's designed to be like, can you do light, CSS and React work? Like, we don't want people to just be completely boxed out of a core part of the technology. Our front-end engineers and our back-end engineers kind of flow back and forth, and everybody has their spikes. It's not like we're expecting a back-end engineer to be deep in React, but we don't want people to have these really hard boundaries, because that can often create just like a lot of really annoying inefficiencies in the organization. And so, yes, we are seeing that blur. We're sort of seeing that intensify, I would say. Like, designers and product managers are like, can go much deeper kind of in what they're able to contribute than they used to be. But, we hired a lot of people who are excited about that. So I think that's like just strictly a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, and maybe this is a nice segue into a less kind of AI, more style topic, but Hex has incredible style. Hex is just cool. I don't know how to explain. Like, you go to the Hex website, and it's been like this for years and years and years. I feel like the website, cool. The booths at conferences, unhinged. It's like
in a good way.
In a good way. I'm sorry. Like a retro dining booth. Hex is throwing like magic shows. What? I don't know how to ask this. How did Hex acquire such immaculate style?
Well, I'm gonna have to give some credit to some other people in the organization for that one. My co-founder Barry. The second person we ever hired was Adam, our head of design, and I think those two have been kind of the masterminds. Also, Annie, our head of brand design, have been the masterminds of a lot of these things. So in some ways, it's down to specific individuals and having particular individuals who have these kind of off the wall takes. But I think also it's about the culture that you build as an organization, and who you find, and us trying to bring in people who are creative, who don't take themselves too seriously. And when you have some of those things, it creates an environment where you can be generative and think differently like this. And yeah, so it's both. There's like some very, very talented people that we have, and also, the team that we built around them.
Yeah. I really like the Hex. Like, the Hex color scheme is like, so like, it really stands out in like tech. No one is like pink and cream and brown. Like, that's, I mean, probably now that's the next trend. But like, I kind of love, like, we spend a lot of effort at Posit coming up with our logo and stuff, but just like blue and orange is just like such a like traditional kind of tech color scheme. It's just fascinating to see, like, as we grow as a company, how these kind of forces of like unification and kind of corporatization like pull on you towards these, just like, this is like the safe choice. And
yeah, and some of that just has to do with, you have to scale your content and branding engine. And so early on, a lot of creativity can actually just come from particular individuals. And you almost always get certainly a more like unique result when you're doing that, and you're doing that in small teams. And then you get to a point where it's like, oh, you have to write all of this content, and you have to put out things on Twitter and LinkedIn to get the, SEO or AEO or whatever we're doing now. And just the amount of stuff that you have to produce can't bottleneck through your main creative engines. And sometimes you can scale, like you obviously scale your brand voice and your brand styling and things like that, but you can't do it perfectly. And so I do think that, we're trying to fight really hard against this and trying to like balance the two, but you do sometimes sort of inevitably feel this like regression towards the mean pull, just like the more and more stuff you have to do on the branding side.
Well, yeah, and it's sort of also interesting, just as the company grows, like the amount of visibility you have within all of the parts of the organization. And this like sounds weird coming from a data person, but like, you are forced to start developing like metrics so that you can get some oversight. And then like, metrics are good, obviously, but they're also bad because they kind of like trap you into these like predefined, how do you like wrestle with that as like clearly a data-driven company, but you don't want to be like too data-driven at the same time?
Yeah, I think for me, a lot of it has come down to being able to sort of shift the altitude at which you operate, and then knowing when is the right time to be at what altitude. So obviously it's extremely important, as a senior leader of a company, to be thinking about strategy and long-term time horizons. And I spend a lot of time, obviously we spend a lot of time talking about AI. That's where I spend our AI strategy is where I spend a lot of my time thinking. And then, you're intermediated through layers and layers of organization. And sometimes there's something down at the bottom that's like not going well. And if you've built a good organization, you'll know about that most of the time. But sometimes you don't. And sometimes you see things in the data, or you see things, that don't feel right. And I think for me, cultivating that kind of like instinct of, hey, this section feels like there's something not working here. The vibes are off. And being able to just do a deep dive on that. And in order to be able to do that, you have to know enough about the things that are like happening on the ground. And so for me, when I first started really building up a bunch of our AI programs, and I still do actually, like I read the papers, like I spend a bunch of time in the technology, and that's to both to like be able to see the big picture, but also when something's not right on the ground, to be able to kind of go all the way down and like help debug, where something is breaking down.
Yeah, as CTO of Hex, I'm so curious, what does that look like? Like, what's your day-to-day look like?
It's a pretty big range of things. I think one of the funny things about being CTO is sometimes I feel like my job is more about humans than it is about technology, even though technology is in the title. And so a lot of it is about, when I'm not sort of thinking about the AI side of the AI technology side of things, a lot of it is about like how are we running a functional technology organization? And there's engineering, there's data, there's our sort of AI research side, there's security, there's all of these things involved in that. And a lot of that day to day is actually not necessarily like making technology decisions. Like I've hired smart people. If I've done, especially in areas like security where I'm not the expert, if I've done my job right, I've hired people who are better at making those technology decisions than I am. It's about, setting up the humans to do their best work.
But as someone who's like come up from the kind of technical side, like how do you still, is there some amount of programming like you just want to do to kind of like scratch that internal itch?
You're
of
like, let me cook.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of it I try to do on sort of side, less, mission critical path things right now. Some of it is actually fun to get. So when I was in college, my concentration was on called ML. And then I did my master's in NLP. And so I've always really been interested in this side of the house, but this was over 10 years ago.
For people who might know, NLP is natural language processing.
Yeah.
And it's all about,
it's basically it's like pre-LLMs, pre-generative AI, how you operated with natural language in a statistical sort of modeling sense. And actually a lot of the techniques back when I was in college were sort of hilariously primitive versions of what we have today, if that makes sense. So, but it was pretty clear, this was 2012. It was pretty clear that this was like the stuff that they were doing was like kind of neat. And you could like see some interesting properties of language with it, but like your ability, you couldn't generate text, like your ability to actually do things like machine translation was like a big area of study back then. And it was like, comically bad, it was like, you could get the gist of what the text was saying, but it wasn't anywhere approximating real speech. And it was pretty clear to me that like the techniques that we were learning about as state of the art at the time were like not it. And so I kind of like left that and went into just core software engineering because I was like, I want to do something real. I want to do something that's like practical. And then sure enough, a few years later, Attention Was All You Need was published, and it's kind of like off to the races from there. But so sometimes it's me getting hands-on and building things, and sometimes it's me just like getting back into that has been really fun, and spending some time not just like reading blogs, but like reading the actual underlying papers and like understanding the research side has been just like super fun over the last couple of years. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. So you've been kind of diving back into NLP. It kind of like reignited.
Yeah, I mean, well, now it's just, all generative AI, and it's like, it's sort of a blurred line. Large language models do so many more things other than just NLP. But yeah, a lot of it is like, again, at the foundational level, like, similar techniques. It's all just matrix multiplication under the hood anyway.
But it is interesting, like, like named named entity recognition
Yeah.
used to be like this really challenging
Yeah.
thing. You have to have a massive tech stack specifically for that. And now you just like throw it at any
Yeah,
like
it's a
random
solved
LLM
problem.
and it does
Yeah.
a good job.
If I'm a barbarian, what's named entity recognition?
Like, you know, if you've got like a blog post and you just want to extract all the people's names that were mentioned in it, like you can't do that with a regular expression.
one of the hard problems,
obviously.
naming things.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah, extracting names of things.
Extracting names from things.
Like I remember a very long time ago, Hillary Mason had this really cool blog post where she scraped like 200 chocolate chip cookie recipes and then created like the average chocolate chip cookie recipe, which she then made. And like back then that was a lot of work. I was like, wow, that is so cool. And that is now something I could do today in, you know, like 30 minutes with
or less than
structure.
that. You just ask ChatGPT for a chocolate
Well,
chip
copy
cookie recipe,
paste.
and that's basically
That's true.
probably
Yeah,
what
what you
it's
get.
doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Ben Stancil mentioned something about this too, where like, and having to do with data work, like support. If you have like thousands of support tickets, you know, as a data team, you might have used to go in and try to analyze it and maybe like calculate a number from support tickets. He mentioned, yeah, like nowadays you might even just dump your support tickets into like ChatGPT or something and just ask like your question directly. Whereas before we were trying to roll up numbers to try to kind of
You try to have to do some sort of
get
like
in between.
you have to like take the unstructured thing and then, you know, run some models over it, maybe some classifiers, maybe some sentiment analysis, maybe you're like extracting specific signal from it. And then you get this like very, very limited structured representation of it, topic clustering or whatever. And then you like try to figure out what's going on based on that. And some of that actually is still very complementary, I would say, because, you know, LLMs are, you know, non-deterministic and they're not very precise, and especially for things that are like, if you're just dumping a bunch of unstructured data into them for things that require, you know, numerical calculations and things, like marrying those two things can be challenging. But for things like, you know, what are the most common, you know, user complaints? I've done this in Hex, on Hex data. And you can, it's actually like very, very fast and very powerful to pull out that kind of signal.
Yeah. Are you saying like user complaints, you can get surprisingly far by putting a lot of the feedback in and just asking?
Yeah.
Yeah. Just get straight to the kind of where you're going.
Yeah. And you probably want to move into the more structured realm when you're getting to the point where you're like trying to be like, okay, well, what fraction of users are asking about this? And, you know, how does that compare to like time to resolve the tickets and things like that? Then you probably do want to start to shift into like a more classically structured data.
But often you just want, like, imagine like someone read all the support tickets and they're just going to give you the vibes. Like that's super useful, even if they can't tell you, oh, like 25% of the support tickets are about blah. Yeah.
Yeah. I like it's like a alternative data science workflow. If you have this like from like R for data science, you have this workflow that's like import, tidy, transform. I like the alternative, which is like copy paste.
Yeah.
Just try to get to,
Just give me the vibes and then you like figure
and then
it
you
out.
can iterate.
But I think I even find that with like some of my projects where I'm just like, hey, Claude Code, just do this. Like, look at this transcript, do this stuff to it. And then I'm like, okay, this it feels like this has teeth. And then I'm like, okay, now Claude Code, write the code that will do that for me, like reliably and reproducibly. Like that's just to be able to do that very, very quick initial prototype to say like, is there anything here that I should bother exploring further?
You have come from, you know, co-founder, you're CTO. I'm really curious, like, what does success look like for you, especially, you know, in the age of AI? Maybe how has that changed throughout your career?
Yeah, I think starting a company has really forced me to like disentangle myself from classic indicators of success, if that makes sense. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is you'll just drive yourself absolutely insane. You're like, that company has how much revenue and they raised how much? Like you just can't compare yourself. Like a lot of us, you know, come up through school, you're basically like ruthlessly, you know, trained to optimize this like one metric and like compare yourself against all the other people to get into, and like you just have to just let all of that go. Like you just have to let the numbers go, and focus on, you know, what you can control. And I think the other thing about being a co-founder that I found is that the hardest part about being a co-founder is that the job changes every 6 months. And so what that means is just as you're getting your feet under you, you have to do something different. And so you're always in this mode of like, I'm not good at the thing I'm supposed to be doing right now. I'm learning how to do this. And for someone who, generally, had a relatively successful career prior to that, you're used to operating in areas where you're good and you're strong and things that you were hired for and you interviewed well for and you're like great at software engineering. And being a co-founder is just like not like that. And so all of these like classic ways of being like, I am successful, just kind of go out the window. And I think for me, I just kind of keep coming back to a couple of different things. One is, are we building something that, is doing good for the world, that is a useful contribution? And then am I enjoying what I'm doing? Is this a good use of my time? And as long as I feel like, and you don't have to enjoy everything that you're doing, but like sort of in the macro. And as long as you feel like those two things are happening, then I think that's like it's actually, I feel like it's quite rare to really be nailing both of those things. And so that's kind of how I've been thinking about my own personal career success.
Do you feel like there was one pivot that was like, this is the hardest thing or this is the easiest thing? Was there one pivot that felt like it hit harder than the rest?
I don't know. I think in some ways I kind of, from the beginning of Hex, had to make that pivot even just to start the company. And it was a bit of a sort of mental hurdle to get over because prior to that, my career had been extremely linear. It was like IC and then manager of managers. And then like, you just kind of like walking up that and taking a step away from that. And also candidly, like, I went into Hex being like, I don't know if this is going to work, right? Most startups don't work. We may all be back on the job market in a year or two. And that would feel like failure. But I think getting past that and being like, is that the worst thing in the world? Like we try something and it doesn't work out. Like maybe you're like slightly embarrassed. Like, I don't know, like what is the actual negative outcome there? And kind of pushing through that feeling of like, oh, what if it fails? Well, what if it does fail? So what? We all go, like, we're all software engineers. We all go get jobs. And I think that was probably the biggest mindset change. And even just like jumping off and then, having to kind of repeatedly remind myself of that over the years.
One of the frameworks I found really useful is like the sort of idea of maximizing versus satisficing. Like I feel like, data people have like had good grades at school, like your natural thing is to always like find the best, like maximize. Like I find this a lot when I'm trying to like buy a hotel somewhere. Like I do so much comparison shopping because I'm trying to find like the best combination of location and price,
hotel
facilities.
Maxing,
exactly. Yeah. Whereas the alternative approach of like satisficing, of just finding the first thing that's going to be like good enough. Like that's such a powerful like mindset change. Like you don't have to be like, not everything in your life has to be the best. Just like finding the things that like make you, where you'll be like happy and satisfied. Like that's.
There's an interesting story of like the, step 1 to 2 feels hard, but what was way harder was step 0 to 1. And what mindset shifts do you have to do to even get to a spot where you're at 0 versus, continuing to just go like, oh, well, I'm at 1, I can go to 2, I can go to 3.
It's like the same with like growing a team, like the first person, like going from 0 to 1 is really hard. From 1 to 2, that's not so bad. And then it just gets kind of get on the downhill slope a little bit.
Yeah, this is a pretty common piece of coaching that I give to engineers, which is it's basically telling them, like giving them permission not to be miserable.
I love that.
They often, sometimes in engineering, sometimes you got to do what you got to do. But, sometimes someone, like we had an engineer who moved into an engineering manager role and was miserable. They hated it. And I was like, you can go back. Like we actually intentionally have set up our org structure such that like senior engineer and engineering manager are the same, no pay difference. They're just the same level, just a different title, different role. And coaching people through their first moment of, I tried it and I didn't like it. And I didn't like make it all the way to something that feels like a success moment. But that's okay. I don't have to get there. If I'm really unhappy with what I'm doing, I can just stop. And that, especially like we've been talking about for people, high achievers, that can feel like a failure, because sometimes you're in a spot where you're actually not doing a great job at the thing that you're supposed to be doing, and you feel like you have to push through to get to a point where like you've made it. But I don't know, you only live once, right? Like, what you do with your time matters, and there's only a certain amount of like pushing through. And it really depends on like what the underlying reason is that you're not happy. There's like lots of different reasons, but usually I see this in a case where someone just like, they don't like the role. And that's not a failure. That's just like, you would rather be doing something different. Obviously, like there's differences where, sometimes you do have to power through like tough times in the company, and you just have to like make it out the other side. But those are temporary things. Like the role doesn't change. The role is still the role. And so if you don't like it, don't do it.
You mentioned like the kind of uncertainty of starting a startup reflected in this person's shift to engineering manager. Like you mentioned, the fear of starting a startup and thinking like, what if it fails? And then being able to say like, so what? Like I tried it and I'll still have other things to work on. I'll have learned and grown. And
I think that like mindset shift between like this experiment failed versus I'm a failure, like that's a really big difference.
And to coach an engineer on that like jumping to being an engineering manager is a similar like experiment as starting a company. Because it makes sense for that person. Maybe it is probably as big and as scary of a jump, I'd imagine, to try this like new way of operating and that you might not know how you'll do. So it seems like honestly has got to be so relieving or helpful to know like it's an experiment and you can switch back.
Yeah, and now that we've had this happen in various parts of the organization a couple of times now, and again, it creates this permission structure for people to just try things, and that obviously has like huge positive externalities when people are like less afraid to go out on a limb and try something new.
I mean, again, being the first person to go from engineering manager back to senior engineer, like super scary. Like if you're the fifth one, like
that's a good point. It kind of like snowballs, I guess.
Yeah.
But
it does feel like right now, like creating an engineering culture where people are excited to try experiments, even knowing they're not going to succeed. Like that's like particularly today with AI, just so important. Yeah.
Okay, we went through Hex, life as a CTO. How do you like to unwind at the end of the day? What's your move?
I mean, we do a lot of the normal stuff. I also have a toddler, so not everything is unwinding.
Winding in different ways.
Once he's in bed, though, actually, my husband and I have been we've been playing through together all of the Soulsborne games. Which might be a little bit weird for an unwind session, but it's a really good way to like release some tension. We got to like start, like I hadn't played them before, but like I got started with Elden Ring, and then we like played all the way through Elden Ring, and then the rule is when you die, you pass the controller, so you get a little bit of a break. Like you die, you pass it, and then you get another turn. Do
you have different specializations or jobs in Elden Ring? Would you say you and your husband like?
Yeah, I will say he is much better at sort of like learning the timing of the boss mechanics. So he's typically like he's gonna be a little better than that. I tend to be a little bit better at the like mobs because I'm less reckless than he is. He just like charges in and just get like totally annihilated, and I'm a little more strategic in how I like do the placement of the
My partner and I played a lot of Elden Ring, and I am very much so that avoid the mobs, run away, like learning that you don't have to fight everyone. Didn't realize that was an option in Elden Ring. Life-changing.
It's an option in real life too.
Yeah, I guess for the whole table of Elden Ring players, when you're playing with a person, how is this a collaborative, peaceful act or what?
Act of violence.
You know what I'm saying?
Well, we actually stopped playing real co-op games together because they got too intense, and we were like, or it's just like we've just different play styles. Again, like his is very like just like rush straight at it, and mine's like a little bit like more sort of like careful exploratory, and so we were getting really mad at each other. Like we tried to play Baldur's Gate co-op together, and just like that did not go well. And so I actually think that this model works a lot better. Like one person is in control at any given time.
feel like that's a hot take. I loved Baldur's Gate because split screen, you can almost have a co-adventure, or completely different adventure. Yeah.
Oh, you can split off. You're saying you took the essence of playing separately, but within a
The same
cooperative
game.
game.
Yeah, pretty
You're
much.
like, see ya. And then the screen just splits and you never reunite.
Yeah.
Sometimes. And then it's like, oh no, I'm dying. Can you come help?
Yeah.
And then she'll pop in and have a good
Yeah.
tell everybody
nice.
for me. And
That's incredible.
Yeah, it's a good life.
Caitlin, really appreciate you coming on the test set.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, no, it's been great. I feel like so much to think about. I honestly, I hate to admit it, but I feel like I have to. I hadn't learned about Context Studio, but it is going to live rent free in my head for the next
Should check it out.
probably all my life.
We'll hook you up.
I would love to. I mean, I'm always showing Hex to people. I feel like I don't actually, what you said about Context Studio really kind of blew my mind because I do like a lot of software engineering on data tools, but that strikes me as such a unique, maybe not totally unique problem across a lot of domains, but for data people that need to like curate and stamp and endorse.
It's honestly like this moment in some ways is like a match made in heaven for data people for this workflow, because this is the workflow that data teams have been doing forever, but it's just been so painful and laborious for, relatively little impact. Like if you think, or I mean, obviously there's impact, but like the amount of impact you get out of like all of this labor just sometimes doesn't feel worth it. Like, I don't know if you all remember, or I'm sure you remember, like when semantic models first kind of became a thing, we just didn't see a ton of adoption of semantic models. And it wasn't because people didn't want them. It's just because it was so painful and took so much time to build them out. And now today, and at the end, it's like, okay, yeah, only 2 people are going to be building your dashboards, right? And now today, that's like totally been inverted. Not only can you take, constructs like semantic models and make them available to everybody in the organization in a way they can use, but actually also you can do the curation and you can do the governance much, much more easily with sort of agents yourself.
It is a pretty incredible that like it's both the cost has decreased dramatically and the impact has increased dramatically. Like it's pretty unusual to get both of those at the same time. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so a lot to check out. Yeah, can't recommend Hex enough. I feel like also giving software engineers permission to like try things and fail, I think so relevant, especially with AI where there's a lot of experimentation going on. And then I'm putting in my pocket Elden Ring co-op strategies. I'm going to find peaceful ways to play with my partner. But yeah, thanks so much for coming on. It's been so nice and been great having you.
Awesome. This has been fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
The Test Set is a production of Posit PBC, an open source and enterprise tooling data science software company. This episode was produced in collaboration with creative studio Agi. For more episodes, visit thetestset.co or find us on your favorite podcast platform.